Our presentation today is about Sigmund Freud. Diana Blotti, Daniel Laflouf, Jessica Noon, David Sandoval, and Noor Jabr.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel, and today my group and I will be presenting Sigmund Freud. Let's begin. Sigismund Shlomo Freud, born on May 6, 1856, in Pribor, Czech, was an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis, which is a clinical method for treating psychopathology through dialogue between a patient and a psychoanalyst. He studied in the University of Vienna and became a medical doctor in 1881. He married Martha Bernays in 1886. He had 6 children who were called Mathlide, Jean-Martin, Oliver, Ernst, Sophie, and Anna. Freud lived and worked in Vienna, having set up his clinical practice there in 1886. Upon completing his habilitation in 1885, he was appointed a docent in neuropathology and became an affiliated professor in 1902. He won the Goethe Prize in 1930 and became a foreign member of the Royal Society. He was influenced by Franz Brentano, a German philosopher, psychologist, and Catholic priest, Ernst Bruck, a German physician and psychologist, Karl Klaus, a German zoologist and anatomist. In 1938, Freud left Austria to escape Nazi persecution. He died of a lethal dose of morphine administered at his request by his friend and physician Max Skur. Freud had been suffering agonizing pain caused by an inoperable cancerous tumor in his eye socket and cheek. The cancer had begun as a lesion in his mouth that he discovered in 1923. He died in exile in the United Kingdom and in England in 1939.
Even though Sigmund Freud was a psychiatrist, but he focused more on solving psychological problems through communication, like the talk therapy, for example. Psychotherapy is based around the notion of talking and can solve mental disorders and sometimes severe ones. And by that, 2 methods of psychotherapy were born, the cognitive theory and the electric approach. And in some cases, both are used. Sigmund Freud not only tried and studied the dream interpretation, while back in the day, people claimed that dream had no meaning. But Freud strongly disagreed and said, and he believes, that dreams are the unconscious revealing itself. His famous work is the psychoanalysis. And in details, psychoanalysis is defined as a set of psychological theories and therapeutic techniques that have their origin in the work of theories of Sigmund Freud. The core of psychoanalysis is the belief that people possess unconscious thoughts, feelings, desires, and memories. And by that, his people can gain insight on their current state of mind by bringing the content of the unconscious into the unconscious awareness, so the unknown to the known. The unconscious is based around the childhood experiences and the hidden desires. The human personality is made from 3 components that work at the same time all the time: the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID represents the primal urges and the instant gratification regardless of the social surroundings. The ego, on the other side, is what controls the ID and only satisfies the needs in a socially acceptable way. And the superego tries to perfect and civilize our behavior. It works to suppress all the unacceptable urges of the ID and struggles to make the ego act upon idealistic standards rather upon realistic principles. The superego is presented in the unconscious, preconscious, and the unconscious.
I will be presenting about the personality theory according to Freud. Firstly, Freud's psychoanalysis perspective proposed that childhood sexuality and unconscious motivations influence personality. His theory and associated techniques is called psychoanalysis. What does psychoanalysis mean? It attributes all thoughts and actions to unconscious conflicts. There are 3 levels of consciousness. Conscious is what we're thinking about. Preconscious, what we can readily call to consciousness, such as memories. Unconscious, thoughts, desires, and impulses of which we are not aware of yet. In this slide, I will be talking about the personality structure. First, ID. It is a reservoir of unconscious psychic energy which is always striving to satisfy basic drives in order to survive and reproduce. Ego, the largely conscious part of personality which is, according to Freud, mediates the demands of the ID. Superego and reality. Superego represents internalized ideals and provides standards for judgment and for future aspiration. And as you can see below, I've added a picture in order for you to know more about what I was talking about. In this slide, I will be talking about the defense mechanism. What does that mean? It is a behavior of people which used to separate themselves from unpleasant events, actions, or thoughts. These psychological strategies may help people put distance between themselves and threats or unwanted feelings such as guilt or shame. Now, the following are examples of defense mechanism, and I will be explaining each, and for you to know more, I've added examples for each one of them. Repression pushes threatening thoughts into the unconscious. Reaction formation pushes away threatening impulses by overemphasizing the opposite in one's thoughts and words. Denial, a defense mechanism in which one refuses to acknowledge anxiety-provoking stimuli. Projection, it is which anxiety-arousing impulses are externalized by placing into others. Displacement, the target of one unconscious fear or desire is shifted away from true cause. Sublimation, where dangerous urges are transformed into positive, social acceptable forms. Regression, where one returns to an earlier, safer stage of one's life to escape present threats. Rationalization, defense mechanism, where after the fact logical explanations for behaviors that were actually driven by internal unconscious motives.
Religion is an illusion, and it derives its strength from the fact that it falls in with our instinctual desires, by Sigmund Freud. One of his famous quotes that we will talk about, and I'm gonna represent Freud's theory of religion. Let's see more about his theory. Religion equals wish fulfillment. Let's see what does this mean. Freud's psychological explanation of religion are built on the ideas of Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach developed the idea that God is projection of the unconscious. So Freud added to this his psychological foundation and his own theory. For Freud, religion is wish fulfillment. So religion is thus seen as a childish delusion and atheism as a grown-up realism. Freud called religion an illusion and a collective neurosis to help us overcome inner psychological trauma. He called religion a reversion to childish patterns of thought in response to feeling helpless and guilty. It needs for security and forgiveness. So religion is comparable to a childhood neurosis, one of his another famous quotes about religion. Religion is about projecting our childhood experiences with our parents onto a god or gods. Religion and neurosis are similar products of the human mind. First, neurosis with its compulsive behavior is an individual religiosity, and religion with its repetitive rituals is a universal obsessional neurosis, which also meant as Oedipus complex.
The section that I will be talking about is Sigmund Freud's seduction theory. This theory was presented on April 26, 1899 at the Society of Psychiatry and Neurology in Vienna. His paper, titled The Etiology of Hysteria, states that 18 patients, both male and female, were all victims of infantile sexual abuse. He believed that many mental issues and disorders were caused by repressed memories of sexual abuse while the patient was an infant. This strong statement caused lots of doubts from his colleagues. They believed that it was impossible that every single one of his patients would have been experiencing sexual abuse as infants. It is also important to note that his patients did not tell their story of sexual abuse, but this was all Freud's analytical interpretation of their statements and pushing them to quote-unquote unlock deep unconscious memories. It is also of note that Freud himself reports that most of his patients were unconvinced with the statement that they were actually sexually abused as infants, believing that the experiences that they mentioned were not in fact reports of sexual abuse. In the end, this theory was short-lived, lasting up until the year 1898. He never publicly rejected this theory, but letters to one of his close companions, Wilhelm Fleiss, shows his increasing doubt on his own theory, eventually replacing it with the Oedipus theory. The Oedipus theory believed that all of these stories of infantile abuse were not in fact actually events that happened to the patient, but were fantasies fabricated in the mind of the child at the time. This shift in mentality caused some negatives where the therapist at the time would reject reported sexual abuses on the basis of Sigmund's new theory.